A pair of young men shocked a community when they went on a savage rampage, brutally beating a pair of senior citizens for no apparent reason. However, a judge presented the criminals with an incredibly generous gift when he heard how they had suffered. This story would send shockwaves through the Canadian capital city of Ottawa, not only for the sheer violence involved, but also for the judicial leniency that followed. It was a crisp autumn morning in Ottawa, and 72-year-old Morty White had started his day like any other. After meeting friends for breakfast at a local diner, he made his way to the Scotiabank parking lot, a routine stop on his way to run a few errands. White, a retiree who had lived in the city for decades, was known for his warmth and kindness. He was a fixture in the community, the kind of man who always had a smile for a stranger and a helping hand for a neighbor. White parked his white Subaru in the lot, went inside to use the ATM, and then headed back to his car. Little did he know that his peaceful morning would soon turn into a nightmare. As White approached his vehicle, two figures lurked nearby, seemingly watching him with malicious intent. Before White could react or comprehend what was happening, he was ambushed. "The next thing I remember, it's 9:30, and I'm in an ambulance," White later recalled, his voice still shaky from the ordeal. According to White, whom he would later describe to police as young, tall, and slender of minority descent, had been standing on the sidewalk as he exited the bank. He couldn't make out what they were saying, as their words were spoken in broken English, but the sudden attack that followed left no time for questions. One of the men struck him in the face, sending him crashing to the ground. White was beaten nearly to death in the parking lot, left with devastating injuries. He later recounted the horror to the Ottawa Citizen, describing how the men mercilessly assaulted him, targeting not only his face but also his body. He was struck repeatedly, as if the attackers had no concern for his life. White sustained a fractured pelvis, several broken ribs, a broken nose, and severe bruising. His eyes were blackened, and the swelling on the back of his head indicated just how vicious the attack had been. Despite the brutality, what puzzled both White and the authorities was the fact that he wasn't robbed. His wallet, money, and valuables were untouched. This made the incident all the more disturbing, as it seemed to be a random act of unprovoked violence, an act of cruelty with no clear motive. "I'm obviously upset that it happened," White later said, "but I'm glad that it isn't as bad as it could have been, because if something like that were to happen, it could have easily killed me." The attack on White sent ripples of fear and anger throughout the community. Ottawa is not known for high levels of violent crime, and such an unprovoked assault on a senior citizen was nearly unthinkable. News of the attack spread quickly, leaving many residents wondering if the city they had long considered safe was changing for the worse. For many in the neighborhood, Morty White was more than just another elderly resident. He was a symbol of the quiet dignity that defined their community. His friends and neighbors were outraged, calling for swift justice and harsher penalties for the perpetrators. "I've known Morty for over 20 years, said one of his friends. "He wouldn't hurt a fly. For someone to do something like this to him, it's just sickening. I hope they throw the book at those guys." Others echoed the sentiment, demanding that the justice system take a hard stance on senseless acts of violence, especially against vulnerable citizens. Calls for increased security measures, particularly in public spaces like parking lots and banks, began to emerge as people grew more anxious about their own safety. Not long after the attack on White, police connected the dots to another similarly horrifying incident. Julian Wilson, a 57-year-old man, had been walking down a sidewalk in the same area when one of the two attackers had approached him and, without any provocation, punched him in the face. Wilson's attack followed a disturbingly similar pattern to White's, with no clear motive other than random violence. Thankfully, Wilson managed to escape with fewer injuries than White, but the emotional and psychological scars from the encounter were just as deep. Both men now suffer from anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to shake the terror they experienced. White, who had always been active, was left wheelchair-bound for the foreseeable future, unsure if he would ever regain the same sense of independence he once had. Thanks to surveillance footage from the Scotiabank and nearby cameras, police were able to track down the suspects within days. The two attackers were identified as Yusuf Hussein and Abdirahman Sahal, both 18 years old. Despite their youth, their actions were far from the reckless behavior typically associated with teenage delinquency. Instead, they appeared to be deliberate, calculated, and deeply violent. The community felt a sense of relief knowing that the men responsible had been apprehended. However, what came next would only add insult to injury for the victims and their families. In court, Hussein and Sahal were charged with aggravated assault. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their guilt was not in question. It seemed that justice would be served swiftly, but as the trial unfolded, the focus shifted from the brutality of their crimes to the supposed hardships they had faced. Ontario Court Justice Peter Doody presided over the case, and when it came time for sentencing, the community expected a firm and decisive ruling. After all, these young men had nearly killed an innocent man and assaulted another without any provocation. But the judge's decision stunned everyone. After hearing arguments from the defense, Judge Doody announced that both Hussein and Sahal would serve less than 2 years in jail. The reason? According to their defense attorney, both men had suffered greatly since their arrest, and in Sahal's case, his asthma could potentially worsen during his incarceration. The defense argued that Sahal's medical condition and his emotional stress should be taken into account despite the severity of the crimes. Judge Doody agreed, reducing Sahal's original 3-year sentence by more than 14 months, crediting him for time served and allowing him to walk free in less than 2 years. Hussein's sentence was similarly reduced from 30 months to approximately 23 months behind bars. Nevertheless, I have concluded that the sentences I am imposing are as short as possible, considering all of the circumstances of the offenses and the offenders, Doody stated, a remark that many found hard to swallow. No remorse, no justice? Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the trial was the utter lack of remorse displayed by Sahal. Throughout the proceedings, he never once apologized to his victims or expressed any regret for the pain and suffering he had caused. Instead, the focus remained on his own well-being, his asthma, his emotional stress, and his challenges in dealing with incarceration. Judge Doody, however, showed more sympathy towards Hussein, who had reportedly struggled with mental health issues. During sentencing, Doody acknowledged Hussein's apology, noting that he had expressed shame for his actions and had been working with a psychotherapist to address his coping skills. Hussein has not had an easy path dealing with the mental health system, Doody explained. Hussein said that he was very sorry for what happened that day, that it was a life lesson. He told me that his almost 2 years on house arrest had made him more mature and that he was working with his psychotherapist on his coping skills. He said he was very ashamed of himself, that he knew that Mr. White and Mr. Wilson were innocent victims, and that his apology would not be enough, but hoped that it would help in some way with the healing process. He said this will never happen again. For White and Wilson, the judge's leniency felt like a betrayal. Both men had suffered immensely, not only physically but mentally and emotionally as well. The random nature of the attacks had left them with deep scars, and knowing that their attackers would soon be back on the streets was a source of constant fear. White expressed uncertainty about his future, particularly regarding his mobility. Although he had survived the attack, he was unsure whether he would ever fully recover from the physical trauma. He had spent months in a wheelchair, unsure if he would ever walk unaided again. Wilson, too, dealt with the lingering effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. Everyday tasks, like walking down the street, now filled him with dread. Both men had to adjust to a new reality, one where their sense of safety and security had been shattered. The sentences handed down by Judge Doody sent shockwaves throughout Ottawa. Community members already grappling with the brutality of the attacks were outraged at what they saw as a gross miscarriage of justice. Many argued that the system had prioritized the well-being of the perpetrators over the victims, sending a dangerous message that violence, even against the elderly, would not be met with severe consequences. Local advocacy groups, particularly those supporting victims of violent crime, voiced their discontent. They organized rallies and protests, demanding tougher penalties for unprovoked attacks and greater consideration for the victims who had to live with the consequence of such crimes. The lenient sentencing ignited a broader conversation about the justice system and its apparent failure to protect the most vulnerable in society. Our seniors deserve to feel safe, one protester said, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Morty." If the courts can't deliver justice, then what message are we sending to the criminals out there? That it's okay to beat an elderly man and walk free in under 2 years? For many, the case became a symbol of a broken system, a system that seemed more concerned with rehabilitating offenders than ensuring justice for victims. Critics of the decision argued that the court's leniency was part of a larger trend where judges, in an effort to show compassion, sometimes overlooked the lasting impact on victims. This case, they said, was a clear example of that imbalance. Political leaders in the region were also drawn into the debate, with some calling for sentencing reforms to prevent similar cases from occurring in the future. "We need to ensure that our legal system puts victims first," said one local politician. "It's important to rehabilitate offenders, but not at the expense of the people who have suffered." Others, however, argued that the judge was in a difficult position, trying to balance the need for justice with the understanding that young offenders could still be rehabilitated. They pointed to the fact that both Hussein and Sahal were barely adults and might have a chance at turning their lives around. But for many in the community, such arguments fell on deaf ears. The case also sparked a conversation about violence against the elderly, a demographic often overlooked in discussions about crime prevention. Senior citizens like White and Wilson are more vulnerable to physical harm, and the psychological toll of such violence is often severe. Experts noted that elderly victims of crime tend to suffer longer-lasting trauma, both physically and mentally, due to their age and decreased ability to recover from injuries. Doctors treating White expressed concerns about his long-term recovery, especially since he had already been battling age-related mobility issues before the attack. At his age, a broken pelvis can take months, if not years, to heal fully, one physician noted, and the psychological scars, those might never go away. Family members of both victims also spoke out, emphasizing the emotional toll the assaults had taken. White's daughter, Rachel, was especially vocal in her disappointment with the legal system, describing her father as a man who had given so much to his community, only to be left feeling abandoned when he needed the system's protection the most.